Hi, this is Pete Cook with the Pete Cook Home Group in Keller Williams, downtown Denver. I want to spend a minute and go over what a contract looks like for you so you're ready as a seller or ready as a buyer to get at least the gist of it. These are great documents. They're well written, well thought out, and important to read. However, I think an overview is a helpful start, at least in this process. So this does not replace knowing it, owning it, reading it, but hope this is helpful. Here we go. Okay, so all these forms are written by the Colorado Real Estate Commission, and here is their dating of it and the fact that they wrote it. Get rid of this side here. Great. I'm going to cruise through and give you the bullet points and by section here, by number. If you have a contract in front of you, you can play along at home. And if not, and you want one, I'll probably be sending you one pretty soon, I guess, or we'll be talking about getting one together. This is the agreement. This just defines exactly what we're talking about, confines it to this. If you're buying a house, everything discussed within the process is listed within here. The buyer's names are defined here. Tenancy is a matter of joint tenants, means there's survivorship in the event that something happens, one thing happens to the other. If you have other rules of how you might want to have multiple people buy that one property, we'll get into tenants in common and other, but this is the most common relationship. Contract is not assignable. That just means that you're not pretending to be a buyer and then have your uncle come in who's the actual buyer and just you write basically their name on this contract and they become the buyer. This is defined as between you and the seller, and that doesn't change. Property address goes right here. Legal description, which is a jumble of small words and letters and numbers, goes right there. Both just defining what we're talking about. Inclusions, garage door openers, depending on how many garage bays are in there. Typically, there's a garage door opener for each bay. If there were security systems, water softeners, and that kind of stuff, and the buyer wanted to define what was being asked for, that would be right here. Personal property is the stuff that can be moved, but is considered part of the property. So if you're advertising all appliances included, and you have refrigerator and things that are still technically personal property, we define them as here to say, hey, these are sticking with the property upon the sale. This is a preference of the buyer, preference of the seller. Hopefully the MLS matches up what the buyer wants. This is all negotiable. This is typical to see all appliances included. It's easier to sell and easier to move into, and you get a better price for a house that's complete. Just defining there's a two-car garage on this one particular property. Exclusions, if the seller had asked for or defined in the MLS, we are taking the refrigerator, taking the chandelier, taking the door knocker, or taking something attached to the house that's sentimental and personal. Hopefully they excluded it in the MLS, and that exclusion is matched here. And basically this is just defining so everyone knows that that one chandelier is going with the sellers. We don't have water rights or well rights. Well right actually happens, but we don't have too much of water rights and other rights, water stock or the things transferring with a sale. So I'm just going to cruise. I'm going to go by the sections that are not likely and the sections that are not negotiated. And the idea is to get you a couple minutes of the highlights of this, and then we can spend time on the other details that come to mind as we go. Dates and deadlines. Each one of these references is referring to a paragraph that shows up later in the contract. So 4.3 for earnest money deadline. If you scroll down by number, 4.3 is earnest money. So the rules and the regulations of earnest money are there. But we have this chart up front so that a buyer and an agent and a seller, agents, can understand the timing of this whole contract in one place. Typically, I review each of these paragraphs just here because it's important and it's easy to kind of hit it up here, and we'll maybe talk about it further in this video as we come across it. Earnest money deadline, 1 day after mutual execution of contract, just means once the negotiations have stopped, everyone signed something, buyers 24 hours to get the earnest money deposited with the title company. Record title deadline is a date. All of these dates are basically the review of what's currently on the title. This is a chance to review what's off record on the title. If there were oral, verbal, other agreements that aren't recorded against the property and are part of this transaction, you get a chance to look at them here. And the entire title, meaning really defining what's included title-wise and meaning who has a lien against the property or claim against the property, is to be defined in this situation by February 1st. If there is an HOA in the property, the buyer has the right to review the HOA and rules and regulations and object to them, and hopefully they work. There are some HOAs that are restrictive, so sometimes just pets are working on cars that are the triggers, but this is the buyer's chance to write the offer, go forward, get the offer accepted, but understand that they have a good chance to some time to review the HOA rules and regulations. Seller's property disclosure should be sent before the offer. In the event a buyer is sending this and hasn't talked to the listing agent and just wants to get it in, they're saying, hey, give me the disclosure at least a day or before a day after execution of contract. Most buyers have completed a loan application. It's a competitive market. You've got to have your lending together to win deals. So this is typically completed. Loan objection deadline is the last deadline a buyer can raise their hand and say subjectively, to the buyer's opinion, they can't afford the property. And that means, does the rate make sense? Does their financial picture make sense? Those are moving targets a little bit. So the seller is at risk through this point of the buyer just basically stating, I can't afford it. It's not typical that someone will go through this entire process and inspect, write offers, drive around in cars and compete and not really want to buy it. So typically a loan objection deadline or a loan objection that gets executed is a pretty big situation and not incredibly common in the process, but know that right is there. If the buyer was taking over the seller's loan, which will happen eventually sometime in the future again, this is the chance for the seller to look at the the buyer to look at the existing loan documents of the seller. Not common right now. It will come back as interest rates change and these people in today's rates sell homes in the future. Appraisal deadline is just that once we're through inspection, appraisal is typically ordered. It takes a little bit to get there in terms of get a result. And if the appraisal comes in, either price is too low or the house is not functional enough for an FHA appraisal, this is the buyer's chance to say, hey, this doesn't work. FHA basically waives this. Conventional loans do not waive this date, but the big discussion comes down to, is the value there? And right now the market is so fast that sometimes consumer interest in terms of what they'll pay definitely leaves the actual value in the dust. In terms of actual value, meaning what an appraiser can use as history for sales in the area. Complicated subject for this current seller's market, but in short, this is the chance to say, hey, the house doesn't appraise for the number, or my appraiser says the house is kind of broken. What are we going to do, meaning buyer seller, to make this get through the appraisal process? ILC is a survey improvement location certificate, meaning is the house where it should be, is a structure where it should be. These can be called by the lender or title for clarification if need be. Not incredibly common if the house has been resold and the boundaries all look good, but that's what these dates are for if you're executing it. Inspection objection deadline. The buyer has to have the inspection completed by the 28th in this contract and objected to the seller, meaning, hey, we checked out the house, sewer line's broken, we want to repair, or it's really great, but these lights don't turn on, or things like that. So this is the buyer's chance to object to those items. And then once those objections are in the seller's hand in this contract, the resolution of what the seller's willing to do and an agreement from the buyer on that list is due the next day. in a good, we have longer dates on this because it may be hard to get an inspector out, but ideally this is the very, very first thing a buyer does. So if we have things to deal with, we get them on the table quickly and give the seller more time than 24 hours to get a resolution on that. Property insurance objection deadline is just simple as it is. You want to make sure the insurance rate for the property makes sense and there aren't weird things that cause a higher rate. The most common surprise or a surprise that it's expensive is flood insurance. So just call your insurance agent. Say, hey, what's a quote for this house, and see if it's in line, and they'll be able to tell you that pretty quickly. Due diligence documents delivery deadline is a chance to review documents that are part of the transaction or promises that are not actually written in this transaction. It might be sellers going to provide warranty on X, or there's a lease in place that the buyer's going to review. These are the kind of documents that we put a time cap on to say, hey, we want a chance to review these and object to them with these deadlines. Closing date. Pretty obvious. Possession delivery of deed, meaning when the money and keys change hands, the seller is moved out and the buyer has a clean, ready to move in house. Possession date is negotiated. Sometimes the seller wants a couple extra days. Sometimes the seller needs a month because they're still in the purchase of buying a house. And then the acceptance deadline date is just basically when the seller needs to respond by. Okay, that's the bulk of the terms or the concepts of this, and I'm going to cruise through this a little faster to get to the more exciting stuff, which is price. This is the purchase price in this offer. This is how much earnest money the buyer is going to write a check to title for, and then this is the amount this buyer is going to borrow. So if you take $335 and you take out $323 of a loan, there's a $6,000 the buyer put down, and then at the closing table, the buyer brings a check for about $57.25. That number changes a little bit because there are different fees associated with a loan that may bring it up and by a little bit or a lot, depending on kind of the loan structure and all that stuff. So this is at least what is promised in the forms. And the seller in this paragraph is learning that the buyer has $11,000 down on $300,000. It's a few percent. It helps the seller understand if this person's a 20% buyer and more financially solid, or at least putting more money into the transaction, which is just a subjective piece of data, because at the end of the day, the seller's going to get this money. But if the structure looks weak and we've got stronger offers, this is an area that can be part of the negotiations. Seller concessions have kind of gone away. Buyers do not expect sellers to give them closing costs or roll it into the contract anymore. It'll come back at some point. Right now, I'm going to skip over it. It'll come back in the future. Right now, it's just not really common. Earnest money, this is defining held by land title in this situation. If you were to say, seller, I'm paying $100,000 cash and borrowing $200,000 to buy a home, this states the buyer has can prove that the money exists, and usually that's like a copy or an image of a bank statement with the numbers whited out. White out, I sound dated. Blocked out. Loan limitations. This person is offering. This buyer is presenting a conventional loan, and that's just different than FHA and VA. Conventional loans typically have a less appraisal restrictions on the property, and FHA and VA need the house to be as habitable as possible. That's the shortest story between these two, and that's why conventional is more appealing to a seller. It's also appealing to a buyer sometimes on terms, rate, and mortgage interest, which has become expensive. The buyer is not assuming the seller's loan, so this has been blocked out. And the seller is not offering private financing, so this part of this contract's been blocked out. This is common and typical. This is the best/worst paragraph in the entire contract, and it's important for buyers and sellers to understand. And so I read it. Buyers to pay all their part of the purchase price of the new loan. This contract is conditional upon buyer determining in buyer's sole subjective discretion whether new loan is satisfactory to buyer, including availability, payments, terms, interest rate. Da, da, da. So buyer can say, I don't like the terms, pretty far into this. So just know that as a buyer, know that as a seller. This is the last hurdle in a contract in terms of likelihood to close. So once we're past that, it always feels like we're really there. Let's see here. Appraisal conditions. I talked about this briefly. The house has to be habitable and the right value. And those are the bigger picture terms of what the appraisal is all about. Please read these contracts, but I'm going to cruise past them because I've already blabbed about them a little bit and it gets a little boring. Homeowners Association, HOA, buyer just has the right to see that the HOA is going to work for them in terms of is it financially solid? What does it include? And what are the restrictions? Pets, working on cars are kind of common objections from a buyer in an HOA. And the buyer can review minutes, financials, all that kind of stuff. And the seller typically has to provide it. And we've, seller typically in our market is selecting the title insurance. So they've done some preliminary homework before they're ever hit the market. So there's a relationship started and some price savings with buyers jumping onto the same insurance policy company. It doesn't have to happen that way. It's just common. So I'm just going to leave it at that. Everything's negotiable. So we can talk more about that if that's a concern for you. Every title rep has said the extended coverage is worth it. It's $75 and covers a lot more wild card scenarios for an insurance claim, title insurance claim against the home. And it's a seller's market, so buyers are typically offering to pay that little $75 fee as associated with that. Title. ILC was just, do you get a survey? Seller's property disclosure. This is a section worth reading, and I'm going to talk as quick as I can so I don't bore you guys too long. This is the inspection paragraph. And once a buyer has inspected the home, they have the right to terminate, get their earnest money back if they do this within the right deadlines. Object to it, which is the most common, is say, great, we love the house, we're happy with it, we want to go forward. However, the roof is leaking, or these doors don't open, these windows don't open. We want the seller to basically fix things that anyone would assume works in a house. Furnace, doors, windows, sewer, roof. It's not in spirit to improve the home. Like, wow, those drapes sure are old. We want new drapes. It's not what this is about. And then a resolution deadline is the date that all parties have to be happy with the resolution of what it takes for the buyer to be happy and the seller to be happy to go forward with the contract. I'm going to cruise. Due diligence documents we talked about briefly already. They're not that common unless we have a lease or a warranty or some other promise in terms of the sale, in terms of paper, things agreed to. Wells happen, not in the sale. More disclosure. Seller has to have carbon monoxide alarms within 15 feet of bedrooms. If the home was built before on or before 1979, the seller has to provide a lead-based paint disclosure stating whether they do or do not know if there's lead-based paint in the house, and if there are reports that they have or do not have to that effect. And the buyer reviews that prior to the offer, and the seller's filled that out before listing the house. Sellers disclose in this paragraph if meth was ever manufactured in the house to their knowledge. Oddly, if it was mitigated to meet the standards of the State Board of Health, the seller does not have to disclose that. Short story, if you have concerns about this, and it's a real deal, I mean, it's not a light disclosure, call the police and ask for call records to a house. That's not everything. There are plenty, I'm sure, labs that have been made that never get found out. But if you find a lot of history with the police at a house, drug related, it's worth further questioning, further research, further inspection. I hope you guys are still watching. This creates confusion in closing services fees, and this is the fee that the title company charges to process the transaction. It's usually about $350 to $400, and buyer and seller split that so that the title company, although they're title research, they're also an escrow agency, that they are neutral and no party is saying, I've got my person executing these agreements. If there were miscellaneous fees, which are really uncommon, at least in Denver and without city of Denver and without HOAs, these are not that common, but this defines if there were weird transfer fees associated with that. Newer homes, newer communities with HOAs can have transfer fees. Taxes are split based on the seller's ownership. So if the seller owned through June, they would pay at the closing table 50% of that year's taxes to the buyer, because the buyer is going to see a bill next year, following year. If the seller doesn't deliver it on time per this agreement, they're charged $100 a day in this deal. Default. If the buyer defaults on this contract, their legal exposure or their financial exposure is their earnest money, and that's it. And this is a paragraph saying you can't really drag the world into it, in short. This is just something that's current for this year. Buyer understands purchases as is. This is a competitive tool of the buyer. This is something that a buyer may choose to do based on the status of the house, based on their first impression, or to win. And you do not give up your right to actually inspect the property. So if you do as is and you find out there's something horrible, you can certainly tell the seller, look, we want buying it as is, but we cannot afford to replace X, Y, and Z. So we really can't afford to go forward on those contracts. So you don't have to buy a total dump this way, and that's not the spirit of it. The spirit of this is to say, hey, we're not going to ask you to improve doorknobs in the house. We're going to take it as it is, and we're not going to be nitpicky over the inspection. This is interesting. Also in current, buyer to pay $2,000 over appraised value with a cap at the contract price of $335. So this is a contract written for a house that, who knows, listed, I can't remember right now, maybe for $320, and it may not appraise for $335. So if everyone and their brother brings in offers for $360 on a $320 house, the seller isn't going to get $360 because everyone has the right to only pay appraised value. So if you're aiming up in price, you want to win. This is basically stating, hey, seller, if the house appraises at $325, instead of, we'll be at least $2,000 better than our competition because we'll give you $2,000 over the appraised value. This number is limited to the buyer's ability to bring that number, because the bank is not going to appraise, the bank is not going to loan you the extra money over the appraised value. They want their ratios correct. So this is something, an out of pocket for buyer. And it's important and it's useful, and we can talk more about it if that's where you're headed on this. Buyer signs, sends it in, seller will sign or not sign. This one was not executed by the seller, at least at this form. And oh, here it is, it's rejected. And that's a sad end to this contract video, but it happens. And then this is agent to agent, not buyer to seller, and basically defines who the buyer's agent is. This was me as a buyer's agent, and who the seller's agent is, and how we get paid. And we're always paid typically by the seller's agent, by the seller, right here. And I am paid as a buyer's agent by the list of the firm, which is really the seller in the situation. Whew, that was a long one. Thanks for sticking in. I look forward to meeting with you. We're talking about this in greater detail. Email, call, text questions, and we'll get this to you so you're comfortable with it. That's my goal. And I'm back. Thanks for your time. Hope the video was helpful. I look forward to negotiating with you soon.